Pacific, the duchy, and direct to the world of Kaiserreich, exploring the war of alternative World War I. So that means, what if Germany wins World War I? Well, in our timeline, Germany has not won World War I due to American aggression, because Kaiserreich says how to evade Mexico intruder, and he says, wait, this is Google? Yeah, not yet. Or he sent a telegram to Mexico to evade America in war. Also blew up the American ship. Also, why am I wearing this cap? Well, it was a World War I German field cap used by the Germans. Not only World War I, but the German Revolution, the cap putsch, the Red Uprising, the invasion of Soviet Bavaria, the Polish Wars, German Colonial Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, the Austro-Prussian War, and the Second String War. I like this cap. Instead of this pink figure helmet, but I like drawn on. This is my crown. My actual crown. I'm not wearing my crown today. Who needs a crown when you have this cap? I'm not anti-monarchist, but I supported the monarchy of our nation. And I have low morale, and you have low morale as well. For reasons. One, there's Russian nationalism and imperialism on my YouTube channel that was caused by the treaty. Two, is that I have to connect YouTube, TikTok, and DWI together. And three, my videos are being poorly made. I don't know, it's so hard. Anyway, let's react to the world of Kaiserreich. Also, this good has captions on.
But there's something belonging to others. There's enough for all people to share. When it's sunny June and December too, or in the winter time or spring, there'll be peace without end, every neighbor a friend, with every man a king.
And we are the good people. The world of Kaiserreich.
The war in the West was over. For the second time in 50 years, the flag of the German Empire flew victoriously over Paris. It appeared as if this war was going to be different, but as the First World War, or Weltkrieg, ended, Prussian military might was once again unmatched, leading the Kaiserreich to victory. And yet, even after millions were left dead and nations were in ruin, this was only the beginning. It's often been wondered what the world might have been like had the Central Powers won World War I. It's a common idea in alternate history that explored in books, movies, but what about something more niche? Say a mod for the game Hearts of Iron 4, a strategy game that tells events using only pictures, text, and a world map. But with the magic of modding, knowledge of history, and some good creative vision, this is the world of Kaiserreich, and I want to explore it.
The war that changed everything. No.
The year is 1917. The war is up to this point gone relatively the same. Archduke is shot, things start to get hot, and the overall battles, tactics, and players of the war are the same we all know and love in our timeline. By this phase of the war, the Germans never restart unrestricted submarine warfare, the policy that caused the sinking of the Lusitania and soured U.S. relations with Germany. Not only do they take preventative measures to assure the U.S. stays neutral, they actively promote anti-war propaganda in the States to sway the American population. Russia, as usual, collapses into civil war, allowing the Germans to keep their gains in the East. 1918. In the West, Britain and France attempt a massive offensive that only ends in failure. While the Central Powers have lost some land in the Middle East and are suffering from blockades in both the North Sea and Mediterranean, the gains by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk has given Germany a bit of breathing room. Russia is practically out of the war, so Germany can reorganize on the Western Front. The new plan? To hold out and bide their time another year. 1919. The time has come. Get the boys around. We're dedicating fully to the Western Front. Germany has been able to keep Britain and France at bay, and the Russians distracted long enough to formulate their own new offensive, a blitzkrieg, if you may. This was called the Great Offensive. In March, Germany launches their attack. This new form of modern war overwhelms the Entente, and their line falls apart. Within a matter of months, Paris will be encircled. The French army falls into disarray. Mutinies are bound as the troops become tired, poor planning, and fail to counterattacks. The stalemate has turned into a rout. Italy collapses as Austria gains ground, and even Ethiopia joins in on the fun. Germany and her allies, despite losing morale and resources from the British blockade, had bid their time and successfully gone on the offensive. France had surrendered, but we'll focus on that in a bit. Britain remained on the sidelines. Without an ally on the mainland, there was really nothing they could do. While on the Western Front, the war had been decided, in the East, another fight was brewing, the Civil War. For another 2 years, the Bolsheviks and White armies would clash, but unlike in our timeline, the tides were not in the Red Army's favor. Let's go back to 1918. The Bolsheviks had taken control of the state, and their main concern was simply gaining a reasonable peace with the Germans. The Germans, of course, took advantage of the new government's precarious position. Peace only came after another swift offensive as the Central Power armies waltzed up to Moscow, forcing their own concessions that the Bolsheviks had no choice but to accept. Having the enemy manhandle your new government doesn't really look good. The Bolsheviks were not only humiliated by this, but their tentative hold on to power was absolutely destroyed. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty held. Russia's western holdings were fractured, Ukraine was now an independent state, and the new nations from this really became nothing more than puppets loyal to Germany. The White Army had taken over key points in the south, and even parts of the left had rallied against the Bolsheviks. Long story incredibly short, this is the start of the end for the Red Army. Their own forces were infighting, Lenin was assassinated by a disgruntled group, and the response to root out any enemies of the revolution only created more enemies against the failing Bolsheviks. By 1920, Moscow was the last bastion for the Reds, and the White Army, a mix of leftists, pro-monarchists, and anti-communists, had retaken Russia. With the state of their armies, although victorious, the White Army generals, with Kerensky at its head, had no choice but to recognize the previous treaty with Germany. Russia would never hold the lands in the West again. With the dust finally settled by 1921, the greatest fears of the Entente, now defunct, was realized. The Central Powers were now the victors in Europe. In the Mediterranean, Italy was dissolved into a series of states on the peninsula. New treaties pretty much stripped the losing parties of their colonies and divided the spoils. Germany gained a far bigger hold in Africa. Austria actually didn't die, and the Ottomans, as weak as their rule was, regained territory lost to Italy and Britain. Losing has its consequences, and after such a dramatic loss in the West, France was about to have a revolution. At 11 a.m., November the 11th, 1921, the final declaration of peace was signed. Peace with honor, it was called. But to the losers of such a war, there was no honor. France suffered through the German offensive for years, losing countless in the fields, only to surrender in the last minute. Britain controlled the largest empire ever seen in history, and none of that mattered when signing that peace treaty. Resentment from a tired population was hard to miss in everyday life. Such disillusionment had to be channeled somewhere, and ideas once seen as radical became demanded as necessary. What followed for the next 5 years would be a transformation of Western Europe, one that dramatically began in the last days of the war as the German armies surrounded Paris, threatening to take the entire nation. The army had mutinied, refusing calls by the government for another offensive after so many had failed. A general strike was organized to shut down France, force the government into a concession, and remove them from power. In under a month, the Third Republic would collapse. But before we get to the collapse of yet another French Republic, let's have a chat about syndicalism. Syndicalism was a leftist movement that arose in the late 19th century after the founding of the
Confédération Générale du Travail,
or General Confederation of Labor in English. For simplicity, let's just call them the CGT. The main facet of syndicalism compared to other sects of socialism is the main power in a nation would be in the labor unions themselves, so no central government, but decisions decided by a series of worker-focused collectives. Policies directly in the hands of the working class, from the local level to regional, and finally national. And this encompasses everything from economics to social policy and even military matters. As describing any ideology, it's more complicated than just that, and it varies. It was more prominent in Western Europe before the start of World War I, especially in France, but fell apart once the Soviets took over in Russia. Yada yada, Red Scare, the leading socialist state is Leninist and eventually Stalinist. Syndicalism never reaches real prominence, but is still around today in small circles. In this alternate timeline, the Red Army in Russia is falling. France, the most prominent hotbed for syndicalism and socialism, takes the mantle instead. And what better time for an ideology like syndicalism to take charge than when the government itself collapses? A provisional government was established in the Third Republic's place. Think of it like the Kerensky government, where it was at odds with more extreme factions within the country. Socialists and liberals were at odds with the radical notions of the CGT, who believed they, as the leaders of the unions, held rightful power over France. Before the war against Germany was even over, another one had begun. A civil war between the provisional government and the syndicalists. While in the East, the Bolshevik Revolution was as dead as Lenin, in the West, it had only strengthened. The provisionals knew the military had CGT sympathies and tried to disarm the military under the excuse that the war was coming to an end. The remaining radical portions of the government abdicated in protest and joined the opposition. In a few months, France had gone through 2 different regimes, and the sole power left in the country with any backing or effective influence was the CGT and the syndicalists. And much like the Bolsheviks of our timeline, a period of violence followed as opponents and remaining sympathizers to the Republic or Provisionals were hunted down, achieving peace with Germany quickly only to secure their own position.
And this is Britain.
In Britain, the Labour and Conservative parties had become ineffective. There was a convoluted election, and failed tariff policies meant to help the economy only led to disaster. Economically, Britain was becoming isolated. One coal shortage and rise in unemployment later, and the economy collapsed. Such a bungled mess of policies had only reaffirmed opinions of the government created since the signing of the treaty. A change had to be made. The labor unions of Britain organized nationally, calling for a general strike in March of 1925. Across the island, the cities were packed with workers calling for better reforms and for corrupt leaders to step down. The response against them was swift, and quickly the situation deteriorated. Whoever began the fighting was never known, but propaganda that it was the military that shot first was soon shared to organizers across the nation. The royal family decided to take a trip to Canada to ride out the storm, but this storm wouldn't pass. A revolution had begun. Over the period of 3 months, the UK would cease to exist. Parliament floundered an effective response. The workers transformed into militant revolutionaries, and soon even London itself was on the verge of falling. When the capital eventually did fall, any forces loyal to the crown and Old Britain followed the royal family to Canada. The United Kingdom was disbanded. The Union of Britain was born. The ramifications for this were felt across the entire Commonwealth. The land of the crown was no longer in Europe, but instead Canada. And the chaos from the revolution left loyalties and obligations up in the air. Australia and New Zealand banded together into a single confederation, as did Britain's holdings in the West Indies. Their African colonies were quickly swallowed up by the Germans. Moving on to Italy, while it was divided into a federation, even this quickly fell apart as its new nations began to fall under the easy sway of its much larger neighbors. The newly created Republic of Italy, with its capital in Venice, became a puppet of the Austrians. The Commune of France helped facilitate a socialist revolution in their south, forming the Socialist Republic of Italy. So, small tangent. If you can't tell already, this is what Marx originally predicted would have happened. The workers' revolution was supposed to occur in already industrialized societies, where people were sick of their low wages and terrible working conditions in factories. Just so happened that by a little bit of German trickery and planting of a Lenin, what we associate as the first communist state began in the not industrialized, not highly populated Russia. Alright, tangent over. 3 European countries now were in the hands of the labor unions, the syndicalists, and for this they united into a faction of their own, a buffer against the German system, Middle Europa, an economic alliance that united the puppet states of Germany together with the Reich at the center.
This is us.
As for the actual victors of the war, the post-war years were not some glorious victory dance for the Germans. Millions had still died in the fighting. When the treaties were signed in 1921, the population was just recovering from the last 7 years of food shortages. In a way, it was a miracle at all that the Kaiser's image was not tarnished, but victories do tend to have that positive effect. So what is a Reich to do, and what issues do they need to deal with? Well, for one, the economy. The war, while won, took a tremendous toll out of the market. Manufacturing and factories had to reshift from their wartime production back into civilian mode. Pound this with a reduction in the conscripted military, and now millions of men were returning to civilian life without jobs in German cities. And that's only the domestic issues, as the Reich now oversees the newly liberated nations in the East, who, being recently, founded, their economy wasn't having the best time either, and Germany bore the brunt of this, as the economic bloc was their idea. With some economic reforms in the 1920s under the newly appointed Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, Germany would go through a golden age by the time of his death, with a stable economy and society. Think of it like the 50s in America, in our timeline. Oh yeah, also Germany uses interventionist methods across the world and messes with other people's conflicts, but this video is already long enough. To sum up the state of Europe, the continent is split between a series of military pacts. The syndicalists in the west, the German military bloc of Reichsmacht, and the more neutral nations of the Russian Republic, Austria, and the Ottomans, who I didn't really mention during this as their problems and influence aren't really that important, but hey, it's interesting they exist.
No, AIDS.
Going back in time, the United States went through the 1910s pretty calmly, until the end of the war, that is. The aftermath of a conflict the US wasn't even involved in would forever shift America's balance of power in the world. Germany's monopoly on trade in Europe, alongside loans to Britain and France during the war, now never being repaid, led the US to find itself smaller, weaker, and poorer as a result. Its closest allies now were its own neighbors. With 2 ongoing socialist revolutions occurring, an emergency session of the Socialist Congress was declared in 1920 to discuss what action American leftists should take. Lenin had just been shot, and a rift, not just in America, but globally, was occurring between communists and syndicalists. What was settled wasn't really the important part. This was simply the origin for what would come to decide the next 2 decades for America, as a poor economy would only make politics more extreme and the young nation more fractured. At first, the situation in the 20s were the typical worker riots or protests. The very real Battle of Blair Mountain, look it up, still occurs as miners take up arms in West Virginia. The ensuing battle and calling in of the army leads to 100 dead. There are protests here and violence there throughout the decade. You get it. The US wasn't just losing its influence abroad, but its own government was losing it at home. The stock market collapsed in 1925, going practically uncontested for a century to now being kicked out by new parties on all sides. Socialism, actual socialism, in many circles had gone mainstream. The unions, which had grown in power thanks to the trust busting of Teddy Roosevelt, became more than just forces for workers' rights. Factions were starting to grow. By the 20s, the Midwest had become an active hotbed of socialist and syndicalist activity, so much so it was nicknamed the Red Belt. Get it? By the turn of the 30s, most positions in any of the Red Belt states are either influenced or controlled by socialist politicians, with mainstream parties entirely voted out. The main power behind this success? The CSA. Not that one. The Combined Syndicalists of America, the national body of unions led by Jack Reed, journalist turned politician whose influence has dominated the left in the United States since the end of the war. Without the USSR existing, France and Britain are able to promote their own ideology onto the US, which, while beneficial to the Rust Belt, still causes a scare throughout the rest of the nation. Down south in Louisiana, the politician Huey Long is elected as governor. Long was a very unique politician. Being from one of the poorest states in the Union, when he got into office, the population was rural, poor, and without education. Its infrastructure was non-existent. Long was a man who was against socialism, but his policies, especially the Share the Wealth program, would do everything to expand opportunity in the state. He ran his office with almost dictatorial powers, but was actually incredibly popular. His mantra ran his philosophy: every man a king. I'm not going to go too much into Huey Long. Here are a few videos. A Southern Democrat who used populism and strong-manning opposition to actually do good for the people of Louisiana. And in this alternate timeline, with the US government not having too much credit and the economy in shambles, Long decides to run for president. But upon losing the Democratic nomination, he falls out with mainstream parties, forming his own, the American First Union Party, a coalition of Southern, Christian, and pro-distribution elements with a little bit of populism. The Southern alternative to a failing system that isn't the CSA. Wait a minute. So why was the mainstream government so disliked? 2 words. Herbert Hoover. In his second term, his effect in the office has only led to radicalization on both sides, marred by military operations against protesters and strikers, and generally being seen as a puppet of the elite. When Black Monday occurs, this only leads to more isolation of the Democrats, Republicans, and even progressives. After one of the most convoluted elections in American history between 5 different distinct ideologies, the result, any result, leads immediately into collapse. The Second American Civil War, as it will be called, begins, as the syndicalists in the Midwest declare independence with their new capital in Chicago, as does the American First Unionists with Huey Long at its head. As the centrist government collapses in Washington, General MacArthur declares martial law and immediately mobilizes what remains of the loyalist states around his cause to reunite the U.S. This shockingly quick assumption of power and new dictatorial authority only leads to the western states, now known as the Pacific states, to rebel as well, claiming they're the true successors to what the U.S. once was. Also, New England exists in its own faction, basically a puppet of Canada, and they just kind of want to be left alone. Who will win this fight and who will survive is entirely up in the air. Maybe New England just sweeps everyone. Speaking of which, as the UK fell to the syndicalists, the royal family sought refuge in Canada. Britain's colonies were gobbled up, and the power that was the Entente was a shadow of its former self. Yet even by the 30s, that power is still around, a remnant of the old world. Canada, in the years after the war, has actually been the most stable country outside of Germany, with the head of state remaining the king. The main geopolitical goals for Canada is really just to get the UK back and stop any syndicalist action within their borders. It does have its fair share of problems, though. Corruption is rampant, and there's a constant debate on the status of Quebec. For the most part, Canada is just vengeful Britain, which is words I never thought I would say. The Nationalist Revolution devoured itself as it was consumed by corrupt dictators and fell into a patchwork of squabbling warlords. With the help from the Germans, intervening now in many foreign conflicts, loyalists to the fallen Qing are able to reclaim Beijing. After 2 decades of war, the Chinese population don't care much anymore for democracy, or at least nationalism, which the Germans were more than happy to promote, as they believed having a strong monarch was best for everyone anyway. The Qing's greatest rivals are to the north in Manchuria, the Fengtian government. They claim themselves as the descendants of Sun Yat-sen's revolution. Yet at least for now, they're simply biding their time with aid from the Japanese, waiting to retake Beijing from the Qing. China as a whole is fractured. What was once its territory is now a series of smaller cliques and warlord states competing with one another. The 2 largest factions slowly becoming puppets of the Germans and Japanese looking for control. Who will come up on top is still in the air. With the signing of the treaty in 1921, Germany went from having a few disconnected pieces of Africa to owning basically the center of the continent, a vast stretch that not only absorbed the Congo Free State, but stretches from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. With the collapse of Britain's empire abroad, Middle Africa expanded their control to much of the Gold Coast. Its main rivals remain the French Republic in exile, who is nothing more than the Sahara colonies, and a newly independent Egypt that stretches down into Sudan. In many ways, it's one of the largest political entities on Earth, larger than the continental United States. Yet because of its poor infrastructure and geography, its influence is rarely felt. Its leader is Hermann Goering, whose alternate self in this alternate timeline wishes to make a colonial outpost one of the most profitable colonies in the world. With the previously mentioned collapse, India and much of Southeast Asia fell into land grabs, revolutions, and reorganization. Parts of British control still remained in India as the Dominion of India, a collection of princes and British upper class loyal to the crown. However, their control is vastly diminished, as other princes have rebelled and created their own alliance, known as the Princely Federation. Lightning round over. Kaiserreich is a very in-depth alternate history scenario. So much so, I didn't even get into events with the Ottoman Empire, or the Mongolians, or Brazil, or any other country on Earth. Every nation in some way has changed. This history is just the backdrop, where the lore and stories change with every game. The victor and the history is up to you. So how will this alternate timeline turn out? Will the US remain a single nation after all opposition is purged? Will Britain ever be home to the crown again? Or will Canada simply fall to a syndicalist revolution as it spreads from the south? All of those are wrong. The Kingfish, Huey Long baby, will conquer America. Every single game, every single time, every man a king. Bridges will be built everywhere, even across the Pacific.
That is Kaiserreich. So anyways, if you want to watch this video, make us up below. Please leave a like, and a comment, and subscribe to my channel. If you want to see my demon talk, links down below. If you want to see my TikTok, links down below. If you want to see my Steam, links down below. So thanks for watching, and see you guys later. Bye!